When we think about the Great Patriotic War, we picture tank battles, air battles, and assaults on cities. But there was another war that few people know about, the war on the rivers. The Danube, Dnieper, and Volga turned into battlefields where Soviet river flotillas fought against the Wehrmacht. Monitors with powerful guns, swift armored boats, and landings behind enemy lines. From the first day of the war to the storming of Berlin, river sailors traveled thousands of kilometers along the waterways of Europe. This is the story of how the fleet fought deep within the continent, where it seemed to have no place. A story of heroism that is not mentioned in textbooks. If you are interested in the little-known history of the Great Patriotic War, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Now, here's a question for discussion in the comments. Do you think the river flotillas could have changed the course of the war on their own? Or were they just a supporting force for the land forces? Could the Red Army have done without river ships when crossing the Dnieper, defending Stalingrad, and capturing Budapest and Berlin? Share your opinion in the comments. In the summer of 1940, the map of Europe underwent another change. The Soviet Union regained Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, and with these territories, it gained access to the lower reaches of the mighty Danube, a river that had served as a natural border between empires and states for centuries. But the return of these historic lands meant not only political success, but also a serious military challenge. The new border, stretching over 120 kilometers along the waterway, had to be reliably defended. As early as July 1940, a special military unit began to form in Izmail, which was destined to become a pioneer in river warfare. The Danube military flotilla was created practically from scratch, but the Soviet command understood perfectly well the strategic importance of this waterway. The new unit was based on ships transferred from the Dnieper and vessels allocated from the Black Sea Fleet. These ships arrived in Izmail by rail and under their own power, transforming the quiet Danube city into a naval base. The backbone of the flotilla was formed around 5 river monitors, veritable floating fortresses specially designed for river warfare. The monitor Udarny was a unique ship built back in the 1930s, while the 4 monitors of the SB-37 project, Zheleznyakov, Jemchugin, Martinov, and Rostovtsev, were more modern combat units. These ships carried powerful artillery weapons, twin 102mm guns capable of hitting targets at a distance of more than 10 kilometers. The armor plating of the turrets and vital compartments allowed them to withstand hits from large-caliber shells. In addition to the monitors, the flotilla included 22 armored boats of the 1125 project, fast and maneuverable combat units armed with T-28 tank turrets with 76mm guns. 7 minesweepers were to ensure mine safety, and 6 air gliders were experimental high-speed vessels. The mine layer Kolkoznik, 4 Sea Hunter-class boats, and 17 support vessels completed the fleet. But the flotilla was not limited to floating units. It also included the Danube sector of coastal defense, which had 5 artillery batteries with calibers ranging from 45 to 152 mm. These batteries were located at key points in Izmail, Giurgiu, Zhebra, Novakilia, and Vilkovo. 23 coastal defense guns controlled the river fairway and approaches to the Soviet shore. An anti-aircraft artillery division of 12 76mm guns covered the bases from air raids. The 96th Separate Fighter Squadron, armed with I-53 and I-15BIS fighters, was based in Izmail and provided air cover for the flotilla. Separate marine companies, machine gun and rifle companies, a communications company, and a searchlight company completed the structure of this diverse but formidable military organization. Command of the flotilla was entrusted to Rear Admiral Nikolai Osipovich Abramov, an experienced naval officer who had seen action in World War I and the Civil War. Captain First Rank Vladimir Vasilyevich Grigoriev became Chief of Staff. These men understood that river warfare had its own specific characteristics. It was impossible to maneuver in open spaces, but it was possible to use the bends in the river, islands, and floodplains to approach the enemy covertly. The flotilla was operationally subordinate to the Odessa military district, and its tasks were formulated with extreme clarity. To prevent enemy ships from breaking through below the port of Reni, to prevent the enemy from crossing the Danube in the section from Galatz to the mouth, and to repel, together with army units, a possible attack from Galatz to Giurgiu. Romania, which was under German influence, had its military forces on the opposite bank, and a clash was only a matter of time. In the spring and early summer of 1941, the flotilla underwent intensive combat training. The crews practiced shooting, landing operations, laying minefields, and anti-mine defense. Anti-landing structures were erected on the coast in the areas of Galatz, Izasya, Chatala, and Perirava. Wire barriers were installed, and strong points were created. The command understood perfectly well that the enemy might try to force the Danube and capture a bridgehead on the Soviet bank. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the Danube flotilla was a combat-ready unit, ready to repel aggression. More than 50 warships, 5 coastal batteries, an air squadron, and marine units all created a powerful defensive system on the waterfront. But no one could have predicted that in just a few weeks, these ships and their crews would find themselves in the thick of a war that would change the fate of the entire world. How would the river sailors behave in their first battles with the aggressor? Would the flotilla be able to accomplish its main task, to prevent the enemy from crossing the Danube? The answers to these questions would be provided by the bloodiest war in human history. June 22, 1941, began for the Danube flotilla not with cannon fire and explosions, but with anxious anticipation. The news of Germany's attack on the Soviet Union came early in the morning, but the enemy showed no activity on the Danube section of the front. Romanian troops stationed on the opposite bank took a wait-and-see position. However, the Soviet command understood that this was the calm before the storm, and that Romania, Hitler's loyal ally, would inevitably enter the war. A few days before the start of hostilities, the Danube flotilla was quickly placed under the command of the 14th Rifle Corps, which was responsible for the defense of the entire southern Bessarabia. Coordination between land forces and river ships was to be the key to successful defense of the water border. The ships took up their assigned positions, the coastal batteries were brought to full combat readiness, and the crews were at their combat posts around the clock. On June 22 at 6 p.m., Romania officially declared war on the Soviet Union. Within a few hours, Romanian artillery opened fire on Soviet positions on the banks of the Danube. A river war began, which was to become one of the most dramatic pages in the history of the Danube flotilla. Soviet coastal batteries and ships responded with powerful fire, and the night sky over the Danube lit up with flashes of gunfire and shell explosions. The roar of cannon fire echoed across the water, reverberating off the banks of the great river. But the Soviet command had no intention of limiting itself to defense. Already in the first hours of the war on the Danube, a daring plan was developed to land troops on the Romanian shore, capture a bridgehead, and thwart the enemy's plans to force the river in the opposite direction. Such active defense was intended to demonstrate to the Romanians that the Red Army and Navy were ready not only to repel attacks, but also to launch them themselves. The initiative in the war was of enormous psychological importance. On the night of June 23-24, preparations for the operation began. Selected units of the 14th Rifle Corps were loaded onto the flotilla's ships under cover of darkness. Armored boats and monitors were to cover the landing craft with their gunfire, suppressing enemy firing points on the shore. Intelligence reported that Romanian troops on the opposite bank were not expecting a Soviet landing and had not taken sufficient measures for anti-landing defense. This gave a chance for success. On the morning of June 24, 1941, ships of the Danube Flotilla landed the first Soviet landing force in the Great Patriotic War. This event went down in history as the Danube Landing, an operation that preceded all other landing operations of the Red Army in the early stages of the war. Under the cover of artillery fire from monitors and armored boats, Soviet rifle units crossed the Danube and captured a bridgehead in the Katul-Sulinsky area on the Romanian shore. The landing was swift and well organized. Romanian border guards and army units defending the shore were taken by surprise. Soviet soldiers secured their positions, repelled the first counterattacks, and began to fortify the bridgehead. The flotilla's ships continued to support the Marines with fire, preventing the enemy from bringing up reserves and organizing a powerful counterattack. The 76mm guns of the armored boats methodically destroyed any firing points that appeared. On June 25th, another landing was carried out, expanding the Soviet forces' zone of control on the Romanian coast. Now the Red Army held several bridgeheads, posing a serious threat to Romanian communications along the Danube. The enemy was forced to transfer additional forces to this area, which could have been used on other sections of the front. The strategic effect of the operation exceeded expectations. Instead of advancing, Romanian troops switched to defense and even retreated in some areas. For almost a month, Soviet troops held their positions on the Romanian bank. From June 24 to July 19, ships of the Danube Flotilla provided daily supplies of ammunition, food, and medicine to the landing forces and evacuated the wounded. Armored boats raided the Danube, attacking Romanian river vessels and coastal facilities. Monitors fired methodically at concentrations of enemy troops, artillery batteries, railway stations, and warehouses. The Romanian command made desperate attempts to drive the Soviet landing force into the water. Several times the enemy went on the offensive, using infantry, artillery, and aviation. But each time the attacks were repelled by the steadfastness of the Soviet fighters and the powerful fire of the ship's artillery. The 102mm guns of the monitors turned the Romanian columns into piles of twisted metal. The Danube bridgeheads became a real nightmare for the Romanian troops. However, the overall situation on the front was not in favor of the Soviet Union. German and Romanian troops were advancing in Bessarabia, pushing the southern front units eastward. It was becoming increasingly difficult to hold the bridgeheads on the Romanian bank of the Danube, and, more importantly, pointless, as Soviet troops were retreating from the border. On July 19th, on the orders of the command, the paratroopers were evacuated to the left bank of the Danube. The operation to withdraw troops from the bridgeheads was carried out in an organized manner, without panic or serious losses. The Danube Flotilla brilliantly accomplished its first combat mission. The landing of troops in the first days of the war demonstrated the offensive spirit of the Red Army, even in the most difficult defensive battles. But this was only the first page in the flotilla's combat history. Ahead lay retreat, relocation, the defense of Odessa, and tragic disbandment. Would the flotilla be able to preserve its ships in the looming chaos of war? July and August 1941 became a time of continuous redeployments and fierce rearguard battles for the Danube flotilla. The rapid advance of German and Romanian troops in Bessarabia forced Soviet units to retreat eastward, and the flotilla had to provide cover for the retreating troops from the water. Each day brought new combat tasks, and the ships moved from one section of the river to another, striking the enemy wherever necessary. By the end of July, the flotilla began to retreat from the Danube estuary. Bases in Izmail and other locations were evacuated, and equipment and ammunition were removed. The ships moved up the Danube, then through the Kilia estuary into the Black Sea, and headed for the mouth of the Dniester. This maneuver allowed the flotilla to avoid encirclement and preserve its combat strength. But parting with the Danube was difficult. Just a few weeks after the start of the war, Soviet sailors were forced to leave the river, for the defense of which the flotilla had been created. In early August, the ships entered the Dniester and sailed up to Bender. Here, the flotilla again entered the battle, supporting the troops defending the crossings and retreating to the east. Armored boats patrolled the river, preventing the enemy from crossing the Dniester and getting behind the Soviet troops. Monitors fired on German and Romanian columns, delaying their advance. Every hour gained from the enemy allowed the land forces to retreat in an organized manner and occupy new defensive lines. But it was not possible to hold the Dniester. By mid-August, the enemy had crossed the river in several places, and it became dangerous for the flotilla to remain on the Dniester. The ships received orders to retreat to Odessa, a city that the Soviet command had decided to defend at all costs. Odessa was of enormous strategic importance. This largest Black Sea port tied up significant enemy forces and served as a symbol of Soviet resistance in the northern Black Sea region. On August 15, 1941, the Danube flotilla became part of the Odessa Defense Forces. Most of the ships were included in the Black Sea Fleet's Light Forces Detachment, while some armored boats remained in the Dnieper estuary for river operations. The monitors Udarny, Zheleznyakov, and Zhemchuzhin took up firing positions in the port of Odessa and in the coastal waters, turning into floating artillery batteries. The heroic defense of Odessa lasted 73 days. From August 5 to October 16, 1941, the city held out, even though it was completely surrounded on land. The only link with the mainland remained the sea, and the ships of the Black Sea Fleet, including the vessels of the former Danube flotilla, provided this link. They delivered reinforcements, ammunition, and food to the city, evacuated the wounded, and, most importantly, fired on the advancing Romanian troops. The monitors of the Danube flotilla became a real nightmare for the Romanian soldiers who stormed Odessa. Their 122mm guns rained down a barrage of fire on enemy positions. In 73 days of defense, the monitor Zheleznyakov alone fired more than 1,000 shells. The ship's guns suppressed enemy artillery batteries, destroyed strongholds, and repelled attacks by the Romanian infantry. The monitors were particularly effective when working in conjunction with coastal observers who corrected the fire and guided the ships to the most important targets. Armored boats made daring raids along the coast, attacking Romanian warehouses, communication centers, and motor transport columns. Their small size and maneuverability allowed them to approach the shore at close range, deliver a surprise attack, and quickly escape return fire. The 76mm guns of the armored boats were powerful enough to destroy light fortifications and enemy equipment. The defense of Odessa became a school of courage for the crews of river ships. Many sailors of the Danube Flotilla were awarded orders and medals for heroism shown in the battles for the city. But the losses were heavy. Several armored boats were destroyed by enemy artillery and aircraft fire. The monitors were also damaged, although their armor saved the ships from complete destruction. On October 16, 1941, the Soviet command decided to evacuate troops from Odessa. The city had fulfilled its task. It had pinned down large forces of the Romanian army for 73 days, preventing the enemy from using these troops at Sevastopol or in other areas of the front. The evacuation was carried out in an organized manner, with Black Sea Fleet ships transporting troops, equipment, and the wounded out of the city. Monitors and surviving armored boats of the Danube Flotilla arrived in Sevastopol as part of the evacuation convoy. Here, the river ships continued their combat service, but now in maritime conditions. They were used for air defense of the Black Sea Fleet's main base and for fire support of ground forces in the Sevastopol area. However, the river ships were poorly suited for operations at sea, and their combat value in the new conditions was limited. On November 5, 1941, the Danube Military Flotilla was officially disbanded. Most of the ships became part of the Black Sea Fleet, and the crews were distributed among other units. Thus ended the first chapter in the history of the Danube Flotilla. Short, dramatic, filled with heroism and tragedy. But this was not the end, only a pause. When the Red Army turned west and returned to the great European river, the flotilla would be reborn. To understand how river ships were able to fight against the Wehrmacht and its allies, it is necessary to understand the characteristics of these combat units. River warfare required special ships that differed from ocean cruisers and destroyers. The limited depths of rivers, narrow fairways, and the need to pass under bridges all imposed strict requirements on the design of river military vessels. At the same time, they had to carry powerful enough weapons to effectively hit coastal targets and enemy ships. The backbone of the Soviet river flotillas were monitors, veritable floating fortresses with a small displacement. The term monitor came from the 19th century, when it was used to refer to armored ships with powerful artillery for coastal operations. Soviet river monitors continued this tradition, but were specially designed for rivers. Their main feature was their shallow draft, usually no more than 1.5 meters, which allowed them to operate even in shallow water. The most famous type of Soviet river monitors were the ships of Project 58. These monitors were built in the 1930s and formed the backbone of the Danube, Dnieper, and Pinsk flotillas. Their displacement was about 970 tons, their length was about 80 meters, and their width was more than 12 meters. The monitor's crew numbered about 105 people. The power plant included 2 diesel engines with a capacity of 3,600 horsepower, providing a speed of up to 14 knots. The main armament of the Project 58 monitors consisted of 2 turrets with twin 110mm or 122mm guns. These guns could fire at a range of up to 18 kilometers, which allowed them to hit targets far inland. The rate of fire reached 7 rounds per minute from each gun. The ammunition load was up to 400 shells per ship. Armor-piercing, high-explosive, and shrapnel shells allowed the monitors to effectively engage various types of targets. But powerful artillery was not the monitors' only weapon. The anti-aircraft armament included several large-caliber DSHK machine guns with a caliber of 12.7 mm and twin 70 mm anti-aircraft guns. This enabled the ship to repel attacks by enemy aircraft, which posed a serious threat to river vessels. Some monitors also carried mine armament. They could lay mines in river fairways, creating minefields for the enemy. The armor of the monitors was quite solid for a river ship. The sides in the area of the engine room and ammunition magazines were protected by armor up to 70 millimeters thick. The artillery turrets had frontal armor up to 30 millimeters thick. The wheelhouse and vital compartments were also armored. Such protection allowed the monitors to withstand hits from field artillery shells up to 75 mm in caliber, although more powerful guns posed a serious threat. The second most important type of river combat ships were armored boats. If monitors can be compared to heavy cavalry, then armored boats are the light cavalry of river warfare. Fast and maneuverable, they could operate where monitors could not due to their size or draft. The main types of Soviet armored boats during the war were Projects 1124 and 1125. The 1125 armored boats had a displacement of only 26 tons, a length of 16.5 meters, and a width of just over 3 meters. Their draft was less than 1 meter, which allowed them to operate in very shallow water. 2 aircraft engines, each with a capacity of 540 horsepower, accelerated the boat to a speed of 23 knots. The crew consisted of 7 people. The main weapon of the armored boat was a tank turret from a T-28 light tank with a 76 mm gun of the 1927 model. This weapon could effectively hit not only coastal targets, but also lightly armored enemy ships. Additional armament included 2 DSHK machine guns and a DT machine gun. The armor of the hull and turret was up to 7 millimeters thick, which protected the crew from bullets and shrapnel, but not from direct hits by artillery shells. The tactics for using armored boats were based on their speed and maneuverability. They operated in groups, suddenly appearing in front of the enemy, striking, and quickly retreating. Patrolling river sections, amphibious operations, fighting enemy boats, and providing fire support to ground forces were all part of the armored boats' tasks. They could navigate narrow channels, hide in reed beds, and use the terrain for surprise attacks. Gunboats were the third class of river warships. They were larger than armored boats, but smaller than monitors, with a displacement of 200 to 400 tons. Their artillery armament included guns with a caliber of 76 to 100 mm, anti-aircraft guns, and machine guns. Gunboats were used for patrolling, escorting transports, landing troops, and providing fire support to troops. The river flotillas also included minesweepers to combat the mine threat, mine layers, floating batteries, landing craft, tugs, and transports. Each type of ship played its own role, and only together did they form a combat-ready river flotilla. Could these ships stand up to the professional German army? This was to be tested in the fiercest battles of the war. While the ships of the former Danube flotilla were completing their combat mission near Sevastopol, a new river force was being formed deep within Soviet territory. In the summer of 1941, the great Russian river Volga, was transformed from a peaceful transport artery into a strategic military communication of paramount importance. It was used to transport cargo to the front, evacuate factories and the population from the western regions, and transfer troops. Defending the Volga became a task of national importance, and the Volga military flotilla was created to accomplish this. Officially, the Volga flotilla was formed on October 23, 1941, although preparatory work had begun much earlier. The flotilla was based in Kazan, where there were ship repair plants and the necessary infrastructure. Command of the flotilla was taken by Captain First Rank Yuri Alexandrovich Panteleev, an experienced officer who understood the specifics of river warfare and the organization of river navigation. Initially, the Volga flotilla was modest in size. It consisted of several gunboats converted from civilian vessels, armored boats, minesweepers, and patrol boats. Many ships were created literally on the fly by installing weapons on mobilized river vessels. The Volga River Shipping Company transferred dozens of ships to the flotilla, which were urgently converted into warships and transports. Workers at Kazan factories worked around the clock to provide the flotilla with the necessary equipment. The main task of the Volga flotilla in the first months of its existence was not to fight enemy ships. The Germans had not yet reached the Volga, but to ensure the safety of navigation. The fact is that in the fall of 1941, the German Air Force began dropping mines on the Volga. The Luftwaffe understood the strategic importance of this waterway and tried to paralyze traffic on it. Hundreds of river mines were laid by enemy aircraft in the fairway from Yaroslavl to Astrakhan. The mine warfare on the Volga was particularly fierce. German aircraft flew in at night, at low altitude, and dropped mines in the narrowest and busiest sections of the river. These were bottom-mounted non-contact mines that reacted to the magnetic field of a ship or to changes in water pressure as a ship passed by. It was extremely difficult to detect and defuse such a mine. During the first year of the war, several dozen transports, barges, and passenger steamers were blown up and sank by mines. Hundreds of sailors and passengers were killed. The minesweepers of the Volga flotilla fought heroically against this invisible danger. They swept the fairway using special equipment, magnetic and acoustic trawls that simulated the presence of a ship and caused the mine to explode at a safe distance. The work of the minesweepers was deadly dangerous. The slightest mistake, equipment malfunction, or simply bad luck could cause the boat to hit a mine. Nevertheless, day after day, night after night, the mine-layer sailors went out onto the Volga, clearing the way for transports. Between the fall of 1941 and the summer of 1942, the mine layers of the Volga flotilla defused hundreds of German mines. The exact number cannot be determined, as many mines exploded on their own after their combat life expired or were destroyed at the bottom of the river. But thanks to the work of the minesweepers, traffic on the Volga did not stop. Cargo continued to go to the front, and the evacuation of the population did not stop. In addition to minesweeping, the ships of the Volga flotilla escorted transports, providing them with air defense. The anti-aircraft weapons of gunboats, armored boats, and specially created floating anti-aircraft batteries met German bombers with fire. The air defense system on the Volga included not only ship-based anti-aircraft guns, but also coastal batteries, fighter aircraft, and the VNOS, air surveillance, warning, and communications service. All this created a multi-layered defense of the strategic waterway. In the summer of 1942, the situation changed dramatically. German troops broke through to the Volga in the Stalingrad area. For the first time in the war, the Great River became the front line. The Volga flotilla was transformed from a rear structure into a combat unit directly involved in battles with the enemy. Monitors and gunboats, which had previously been engaged mainly in convoying and air defense, now had to engage in artillery duels with German batteries, support the defenders of Stalingrad with fire, and ensure crossings across the river. Strengthening the flotilla became an urgent task. Additional ships were transferred to Stalingrad, and new brigades of river ships were formed. Converted river steamers, armed with artillery and machine guns, joined the flotilla. Experienced naval artillerymen arrived from the reserves of the Navy. Kazan factories accelerated the construction of armored boats and gunboats. By the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad, the Volga flotilla was an impressive force. During this critical period, command of the flotilla passed to Captain First Rank Dmitry Dmitrievich Rogachev, a strong-willed and decisive officer who understood that the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad could depend on the actions of the flotilla. The flotilla headquarters moved closer to the front, and communication with the troops became more efficient. The ships were given clear combat tasks: to prevent the enemy from crossing the Volga, to ensure the crossing of Soviet troops and cargo, and to support the defenders of the city with fire. The Volga became the arena for one of the fiercest battles of World War II, and the river sailors played a heroic role in this battle. Would the ships of the flotilla be able to withstand the blows of the Luftwaffe and German artillery? Would there be enough ammunition for continuous fire support? Would the flotilla be able to supply the besieged city? The answers were to be found in the most terrible battle of the war. The 23rd of August, 1942, went down in the history of Stalingrad as the most terrible day. The German Air Force launched a massive attack on the city, turning residential areas into a burning hell. But on the same day, German troops broke through to the Volga north of Stalingrad, cutting off the city from its mainland communications. The Volga remained the only link connecting the defenders of Stalingrad with the rear, and the ships of the Volga flotilla became the force that prevented the enemy from cutting that link. The forces directly involved in the Battle of Stalingrad included monitors, gunboats, armored boats, minesweepers, and transport ships. The main forces of the flotilla were concentrated in the Stalingrad area, where a grand battle unfolded. The ships took up positions along the eastern bank of the Volga, turning into floating artillery batteries that could fire on German troops advancing on the city from the west. The gunboat Ussyskin became a legend of the Battle of Stalingrad. This ship, with a displacement of about 250 tons, armed with 4 102mm guns and several machine guns, fought continuously from August to November 1942. The crew, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Efimovich Ussyskin, fired hundreds of shells daily at the positions of the Germans who had occupied the western part of Stalingrad. The gunboat took up a position opposite the Red October factory, one of the key defensive points. From there, its guns controlled a significant section of the coast, preventing the Germans from gaining a foothold. German artillery and aircraft repeatedly attempted to destroy the Ussyskin, but the ship continued to fight. When shells hit the hull, the crew repaired the holes and damage without ceasing fire. When ammunition ran out, barges with new shells approached under enemy fire. The second legendary gunboat of the Volga flotilla was named Chapayev. This ship also carried 102mm guns and operated in the area of the central crossing over the Volga. Its fire covered the troops of the 62nd Army, which defended the city center. Between September and November 1942, the Chapayev fired more than 2,000 shells at the enemy, destroying dozens of firing points, several tanks, and hundreds of enemy soldiers. Cooperation between the ships and the ground forces was excellent. The ships had fire correctors who were in radio contact with forward observers on the shore. They reported the coordinates of the targets, and the ship's artillery struck with high precision. The use of ships against concentrations of enemy troops, columns of equipment, headquarters, and warehouses was particularly effective. 102mm shells, falling at intervals of a few seconds, terrified the German soldiers. But the ships did not just fire. They provided a crossing over the Volga, a vital operation on which the fate of Stalingrad depended. Every night, dozens of ships crossed the river, delivering reinforcements, ammunition, and food to the western bank, and evacuating the wounded. German artillery fired continuously at the crossings, and aircraft bombed the ships and barges, but the movement continued. Boats from the Volga flotilla escorted transports, extinguished fires on burning ships, and rescued people from the water after sinkings. In the fall of 1942, the Germans made several attempts to force the Volga and capture bridgeheads on the eastern bank. Such a maneuver would have allowed them to cut off the last line of communication for the city's defenders, but each attempt was repelled by the Volga flotilla. Armored boats patrolled the river, preventing German engineering units from establishing crossings. The artillery of monitors and gunboats fired on concentrations of German troops and equipment on the shore. In October 1942, the situation in Stalingrad reached a critical point. The Germans had captured most of the city and reached the Volga in several places. Soviet troops held only narrow strips of shore pressed against the river. In these conditions, the ships of the Volga flotilla became the only heavy artillery supporting the city's defenders. It was difficult to deliver large-caliber army guns across the Volga and place them on narrow bridgeheads, but the ships were always in position. General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, wrote in his memoirs that the assistance of the Volga flotilla was invaluable. Ship artillery repelled German attacks, destroyed assault groups, and suppressed firing points. Without this support, it would have been virtually impossible to hold the city. The sailors of the Volga flotilla fought as desperately as the soldiers on shore, even though they were technically on the water. November 1942 brought a radical change. On November 19th, the Soviet counteroffensive began at Stalingrad. The Volga flotilla ensured the transfer of strike forces across the river and supported them with fire. When the encirclement around the German group closed, the role of the flotilla did not diminish. The ships continued to supply the troops, evacuate the wounded, and fire on the surrounded German units. During the Battle of Stalingrad, the ships of the Volga flotilla made thousands of combat sorties, transported hundreds of thousands of soldiers, millions of shells, and tons of cargo across the river, and evacuated tens of thousands of wounded. Their artillery fired tens of thousands of shells at the enemy. The flotilla's losses were heavy. Several ships were lost, many were damaged, and hundreds of sailors fell in battle. But the task was accomplished. Stalingrad held out, and the Volga flotilla proved that river ships could be a formidable force in modern warfare. While the Volga flotilla was preparing for the Battle of Stalingrad, another river unit was fighting dramatic battles on the Western Front. The Pinsk military flotilla operated in a unique region, the swampy rivers of Polesy, where natural conditions created a special context for river warfare. The Pripyat, Berezina, and tributaries of the Dnieper, these waterways cross the territory of Belarus and Ukraine, becoming natural defense lines and lines of communication. The Pinsk flotilla was created in the 1920s to guard the river borders of the Soviet Union in western Belarus. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, it was based in Pinsk and included several Jemchugin-class monitors, a dozen armored boats, gunboats, minesweepers, and auxiliary vessels. The total number of ships was about 40. The crews were well trained and knew the peculiarities of the local waterways, winding, shallow, with many channels and oxbow lakes. On June 22, 1941, the Pinsk flotilla, like the entire Red Army, was in full combat readiness. The German offensive in Belarus was developing rapidly, and the flotilla was tasked with preventing the enemy from crossing the Pripyat River, ensuring the retreat of Soviet troops, and destroying enemy bridges and crossing facilities. The flotilla was commanded by Captain First Rank Dmitry Dmitrievich Rogachev, the same officer who would later head the Volga flotilla. In the first days of the war, the ships of the Pinsk flotilla entered the battle. Monitors and gunboats fired on German troops attempting to force the Pripyat River. Armored boats raided the tributaries of the river, attacking enemy columns on the march. But it was impossible to stop the German advance. The enemy's superiority in forces, especially in aviation and tanks, was overwhelming. Soviet troops retreated, and the flotilla withdrew with them. At the end of June, the flotilla evacuated from Pinsk. Some of the ships broke through up the Pripyat to the Dnieper, while others went along the Berezina. The retreat turned into a continuous battle. German aircraft attacked the ships, and coastal artillery fired at them from the captured shores. Several ships were sunk. Others were damaged. The crews showed remarkable courage, pulling the damaged ships out of enemy fire and repairing them on the go. By mid-July, most of the ships of the Pinsk flotilla had concentrated in the Kiev area, where they joined the Dnieper military flotilla. Some ships were sunk by their crews to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Others broke through eastward along the Dnieper, participating in battles for crossings. The monitors Bobruisk and Vitebsk fought in the Kiev area, supporting the troops defending the Ukrainian capital with their fire. But the fate of these ships was tragic. Both monitors were lost in September 1941. The armored boats of the Pinsk flotilla continued fighting on the Dnieper until autumn. They covered the crossings of retreating troops, evacuated the wounded, and attacked German ships. Gradually, the number of combat-ready ships decreased. Some were blown up by mines, others were destroyed by aircraft and artillery, and still others were sunk due to a lack of fuel and ammunition. By the end of 1941, almost nothing remained of the Pinsk flotilla. The few ships and crews that managed to break through to the east became the basis for the recreation of river flotillas in 1942 and 1943. The experience gained in the fierce battles of the summer and autumn of 1941 proved invaluable. The sailors of the Pinsk flotilla knew how to act in retreat, how to preserve their ships, and how to use river vessels most effectively against a superior enemy. The history of the Pinsk flotilla at the beginning of the war is a story of courage and tragedy. The flotilla fulfilled its duty, covering the army's retreat, delaying the enemy, and inflicting losses on them. But the price was terrible. Most of the ships were lost, and many sailors were killed in battle or taken prisoner. However, the memory of the Pinsk flotilla lived on, and when the Red Army began its offensive to the west, river vessels reappeared on the waters of Belarus. Would the hour of retribution come? Would Soviet sailors return to the Pripyat? The winter and spring of 1943 brought a radical change in the Great Patriotic War. After the victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army went on the offensive on many sections of the front. The liberation of the occupied territories presented the Soviet command with new tasks, including the restoration of control over the river routes. The Dnieper, Pripyat, Desna, and Sozh rivers became the most important communication routes for the advancing troops, and it was necessary to recreate the river flotillas. On March 1, 1943, the Dnieper military flotilla was re-established. Its creation was an act of strategic planning. The Soviet command understood that in the summer of 1943, battles for the Dnieper would unfold, and river ships would be needed. The flotilla's base was located in Saratov, where shipbuilding plants began to form the fleet. The new Dnieper flotilla was based on ships transferred from the Volga flotilla. Several monitors, about 20 armored boats of the 1124 and 1125 projects, gunboats, minesweepers, and landing craft were all relocated to the Dnieper as it was liberated. The ships were transported partly under their own power through connecting canals and partly by rail on special platforms. The flotilla was commanded by Rear Admiral Vissarionovich Grigoriev, an experienced river sailor who had participated in battles on the Volga and knew the specifics of river warfare. Captain First Rank Pyotr Yakovlevich Derzhavin was appointed Chief of Staff. The command staff was formed from officers who had combat experience on the Volga, the Danube, and in the Pinsk flotilla. This ensured that the new unit would be combat-ready from the very first days. Intensive training took place in the spring and summer of 1943. The crews mastered the new ships, practiced coordination with land forces, and studied the peculiarities of the Dnieper. This river was very different from the Volga. Numerous rapids, islands, and bends in the riverbed required special navigation skills. In addition, the Dnieper was the front line in many areas, and sailing on it was extremely dangerous. By the fall of 1943, when the Red Army began crossing the Dnieper flotilla was ready for combat. The ships were relocated to liberated areas and immediately joined the fighting. They provided fire support to troops crossing the river, covered the crossings from enemy counterattacks, and landed troops on the right bank of the Dnieper, attacking German positions. The flotilla was particularly active in the Kiev area. During the Kiev offensive in October-November 1943, the ships ensured the crossing of troops across the Dnieper and participated in the liberation of the Ukrainian capital. Monitors fired on German strongholds on the right bank, armored boats landed assault groups, and minesweepers cleared the fairway of mines. On November 6th, Kiev was liberated, and the Dnieper flotilla contributed to this victory. In the winter of 1943-1944, the flotilla took part in battles on the right bank of Ukraine. The ships supported the troops repelling German counterattacks and supplied the units operating on the right bank of the Dnieper. The conditions were extremely difficult. Ice covered the river, ships froze into the ice, and crews had to fight not only the enemy, but also nature. In the spring of 1944, the Dnieper flotilla was significantly reinforced. It was joined by new armored boats built at factories in the Volga region, additional gunboats, and modern minesweepers. The number of personnel grew to several thousand. The flotilla became a powerful force capable of performing complex combat tasks. In the summer of 1944, the Belarusian strategic offensive operation Bagration began. The Dnieper flotilla was tasked with operating on the Pripyat, Berezina, and other rivers of Belarus. The ships were loaded onto railway platforms and delivered to the combat zones. A new stage in the history of the flotilla was beginning, an advance deep into Europe. Would the river ships be able to travel thousands of kilometers along rivers and canals to Berlin itself? Would they have enough strength for such an unprecedented march? The road to victory lay ahead. On June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after the start of the war, Operation Bagration began, the Red Army's most ambitious offensive in Belarus. The Dnieper military flotilla was tasked with operating on the rivers of Belarus, supporting the advance of the ground forces. The flotilla's ships were transferred to the Pripyat, Berezina, Soj, and other waterways, becoming mobile artillery support for rifle units. The conditions of operation in Belarus were very different from those on the Dnieper. The rivers here were narrower, shallower, and more winding. Swampy banks, dense forests, and numerous small tributaries created difficult conditions for navigation. But it was precisely these features that made river ships particularly valuable. Where tanks got stuck in the swamps and artillery could not be transported on the muddy roads, armored boats and monitors moved freely on the water. The most dramatic battles took place on the Pripyat. This river, flowing through the Polesi marshes, was a natural defensive line for the German troops. The enemy had prepared positions on the banks in advance, set up minefields in the fairway, and prepared bridges for demolition. But the Dnieper flotilla forced these obstacles. Minesweepers cleared the way of mines. Assault groups on armored boats landed on the banks and captured bridgeheads, and monitors suppressed German firing points. On July 14, 1944, the Pinsk landing was carried out, one of the flotilla's most successful landing operations. More than 2,000 soldiers of the 2nd Guards Cavalry Division were transported by riverboats to the German rear and landed in the Pinsk area. The landing force captured a bridgehead, cut off enemy communications, and held their positions until the main forces arrived. The German group in Polesi found itself in a critical situation. The liberation of Pinsk on July 14th was a symbolic event. It was here in 1941 that the Pinsk flotilla was based, and it was here that its tragic combat path began. Now the Soviet river ships had returned, but as part of the Dnieper flotilla, and the city was liberated. Many sailors who had served in the Pinsk flotilla were now fighting in the Dnieper flotilla and greeted the liberation with special feelings. After the liberation of Belarus, the Dnieper flotilla continued its westward movement. The ships sailed up the Pripyat River, then crossed into the western Bug River through a system of canals. It was an extremely difficult transition. They had to overcome locks, shallow areas, and hydraulic structures destroyed by the war. But the flotilla coped. By the autumn of 1944, Soviet river ships were already operating in Poland. The Western Bug became the flotilla's new theater of operations. This river, which had been the Soviet-German border in 1939-1941, was now crossed by the Red Army in the opposite direction. The flotilla's ships supported the troops crossing the river, landed troops, and suppressed German strongholds on the banks. The enemy clung to every line, but the Soviet offensive was unstoppable. In the fall and winter of 1944-1945, the flotilla operated in Poland. The ships participated in the Vistula-Oder offensive, one of the largest offensive operations of the Red Army. Crossing the Vistula, reaching the Oder, at all these stages, the Dnieper flotilla provided support to the troops. Armored boats patrolled the rivers, transported paratroopers, and fired on retreating German units. By January 1945, the flotilla had reached the Oder. The ships entered this German river, advancing deep into the Third Reich. It was a triumphant march, from the Dnieper through the Pripyat, Western Bug, and Vistula to the Oder, almost 2,000 kilometers along the rivers of Eastern Europe. No river flotilla in history had ever made such a crossing. But the final task remained ahead: Berlin. Would the river ships be able to participate in the assault on the German capital? While the Dnieper flotilla began its journey north and west, another legendary river force was being revived in the south. On April 13, 1944, the second formation of the Danube military flotilla was announced in Kherson. 2.5 years had passed since the disbandment of the first Danube flotilla, and now Soviet sailors were preparing to return to the great European river. Rear Admiral Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov, a young and energetic officer who was destined to become an outstanding naval commander and admiral of the Soviet Union, was appointed commander of the flotilla. In 1944, Gorshkov was only 34 years old, but he already had extensive combat experience commanding the Azov military flotilla, participating in the defense of Odessa and Sevastopol and the Kerch-Feodosia landing operation. The formation of the new Danube flotilla was carried out in a hurry. The front was rapidly approaching the Danube, and it was necessary to prepare the ships for combat operations as quickly as possible. The flotilla was based on armored boats transferred from the Sea of Azov, river monitors, gunboats, and minesweepers. Many ships were built or converted at factories in Kherson and Nikolaev specifically for Danube operations. By the end of April, the flotilla had about 80 warships and auxiliary vessels. These included armored boats of various designs, Zheleznyakov-class monitors, gunboats, mine layers, floating batteries, landing craft, tugs, and transports. The personnel strength exceeded 3,000 men. The flotilla was operationally subordinate to the Third Ukrainian Front under the command of Army General Fyodor Ivanovich Tolbukin. On August 20, 1944, the Iasi-Kishinev strategic offensive operation began, one of the most brilliant operations of the Red Army. The troops of the Second and Third Ukrainian Fronts dealt a powerful blow to the German-Romanian forces in Moldova and Romania. The Danube flotilla was tasked with supporting the offensive on the coastal front and preparing to enter the Danube. On August 22nd, the situation changed dramatically. A coup d'état took place in Romania. King Mihai ordered the arrest of Marshal Antonescu and announced Romania's withdrawal from the war on the side of Germany. Romanian troops, who had been fighting against the Red Army just yesterday, now switched to the Soviet side. This opened up unprecedented opportunities for the Danube flotilla. On August 24th, the leading armored boats of the Danube flotilla entered the mouth of the Danube. It was a historic moment. Soviet river ships returned to the river they had left in 1941 under enemy pressure. Now they were returning as victors. The local population welcomed the Soviet sailors as liberators, and Romanian rivermen helped guide the ships through the complex channels of the delta. By the end of August, the flotilla had taken control of the entire Danube delta and began moving upriver. Land forces moved alongside the fleet, liberating the Romanian cities of Tulcea, Brăila, and Galati. German troops remaining in Romania after the coup attempted to retreat to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, but their escape routes were cut off. Many German ships on the Danube were captured or sunk by Soviet vessels. On September 5, 1944, the ships of the Danube flotilla reached the Bulgarian border. Bulgaria also withdrew from the war on Germany's side and declared war on Hitler's coalition. This further facilitated the flotilla's advance along the Danube. Soviet ships occupied the Bulgarian ports of Rus, Silistra, and Lom without a fight. Bulgarian river vessels joined the Soviet flotilla, strengthening its transport capabilities. But the main battles were still ahead. The Danube flows through the center of Europe, and its banks are home to major cities: Belgrade, Budapest, Vienna, and Bratislava. The German command understood the strategic importance of the Danube and created its own river military forces on the river, the Kriegsmarine Flotilla, armed with artillery boats, mine layers, and landing craft. A battle between two river fleets was imminent. Who would win the battle for the Danube? September 1944 was the month of the Danube flotilla's triumphant advance up the river. Gorshkov's ships sailed up the Danube, liberating city after city, landing troops, and destroying German river vessels and coastal fortifications. It was a river raid of unprecedented scale. In 3 weeks, the flotilla traveled more than 800 kilometers from the mouth of the Danube to Belgrade, participating in the liberation of Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. The flotilla's tactics were perfected. Advanced armored boats conducted reconnaissance, identifying minefields and enemy firing points. They were followed by minesweepers, which cleared the fairway. Then came monitors and gunboats, which suppressed coastal defenses. Landing craft disembarked assault groups of Marines who captured key points on the shore. The entire system operated as a single mechanism. Between August and November 1944, the Danube flotilla carried out 20 tactical landing operations. These were landings of various scales, from company-sized landings to capture individual settlements to large-scale operations involving the landing of several battalions. The most significant were the landings in the areas of Prahovo, Turnu Severin, and Negotin. These operations made it possible to cut off the retreat routes of German troops and capture important ports. On September 29th, the Belgrade offensive began, a joint attack by Soviet troops and Yugoslav partisans on the capital of Yugoslavia. The Danube flotilla was tasked with supporting the offensive, operating on the Danube and its tributary, the Sava. The ships landed several assault troops in the Belgrade area, cutting off the German garrison's retreat routes. The flotilla's artillery fired on German positions in the city. On October 20th, 1944, Belgrade was liberated. Soviet troops and Yugoslav partisans entered the capital, while Gorshkov's flotilla stood guard on the Danube and Sava. The liberation of Belgrade was a major political and strategic victory. Yugoslavia was freed from the occupiers, and the Danube was open for further advance into Hungary and Austria. After Belgrade, the flotilla moved on to Hungary. The Danube in the Hungarian section was well fortified by the Germans. The enemy had created a system of coastal batteries, minefields, and anti-landing obstacles. The German river flotilla, reinforced by Hungarian ships, put up active resistance. Real river battles began, ship against ship, artillery against artillery. On October 29th, a major river battle took place in the Batina area. A detachment of Soviet armored boats encountered German artillery boats. A fierce firefight ensued. Soviet 76mm guns fired at the maneuvering German boats, which responded with their 20 37mm automatic guns. The battle lasted more than an hour and ended in victory for the Soviet sailors. 3 German boats were sunk, and the rest withdrew. In November, the Budapest offensive began, one of the bloodiest battles of the final stage of the war. The Danube flotilla actively participated in the battles for the Hungarian capital. The ships supported the troops storming Budapest with fire, landed troops, and provided crossings across the Danube. The Germans turned the city into a fortress and fought with the desperation of the doomed. Budapest was completely surrounded only by December 26th. The winter of 1944-1945 was harsh. The Danube froze over, and ships were stuck in the ice. But even in these conditions, the flotilla continued to operate. Ship artillery fired on German positions in Budapest. Sailors landed on the ice and fought like Marines. When Budapest was finally taken on February 13, 1945, the flotilla contributed to this victory. In the spring of 1945, after the Danube thawed, the flotilla resumed its offensive. Ahead lay Vienna, the capital of Austria, the last major city on the road to victory. The Danube led Soviet ships into the heart of Europe. Would they have enough strength to reach their destination? Would they be able to break the enemy's resistance on its own territory? The war was coming to an end. On March 16, 1945, the Vienna offensive began, the Red Army's last major operation in Europe. Troops of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts advanced on the Austrian capital from the east and south. Gorshkov's Danube flotilla was tasked with supporting the offensive by advancing along the Danube towards Vienna and landing troops on the approaches to the city. The enemy put up desperate resistance. Germany and Austria defended themselves with redoubled energy. The war had come to their own territory. German coastal batteries on the Danube were reinforced, minefields became denser, and the Kriegsmarine River flotilla fought with particular ferocity. Every kilometer of advance along the Danube was hard fought by Soviet sailors. On March 27th, the leading armored boats of the Danube flotilla reached the suburbs of Vienna. The city was located on both banks of the Danube, and the river flowed right through the capital. This created unique conditions for the flotilla's operations. The ships could fire directly at the city quarters, where German troops were entrenched. But this also made the ships vulnerable to enemy fire from buildings on the banks. On April 13th, Vienna was completely liberated. The Danube flotilla participated in the assault on the city, supporting the advance of the troops with artillery fire. But victory came at a high price. Several armored boats were sunk by German artillery, and many ships were damaged. The sailors of the flotilla fought in the center of the European capital, turning the Danube into a front line right in the city. After the fall of Vienna, the Danube flotilla continued its advance upriver. Now the path lay to Czechoslovakia, where a German group was still fighting. But the war was already coming to an end. On May 9, 1945, Germany surrendered. The Great Patriotic War was over, and the Danube flotilla celebrated victory in the waters of the Danube, in the center of Europe. During 9 months of combat operations, from August 1944 to May 1945, the Danube flotilla traveled more than 2,000 kilometers along the Danube. The ships participated in the liberation of Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. 20 major landing operations were carried out, with more than 20,000 paratroopers landed. Ship artillery fired tens of thousands of shells, destroying hundreds of coastal targets and several dozen enemy ships. Simultaneously with the Danube Flotilla, the Dnieper Flotilla fought in the north. In March-April 1945, its ships reached the Oder, then passed through a system of canals into the Spree, the river that flows through Berlin. It was an unprecedented transition. In 3 years, Soviet river ships had traveled from the Volga to the Spree, from Saratov to Berlin. On April 16th, the Berlin operation began, the final battle of the war in Europe. The Dnieper Flotilla participated in the assault on the German capital. The ships fired on Berlin neighborhoods where the remnants of German troops had dug in. Armored boats landed assault groups on the banks of the Spree. Monitors suppressed enemy firing points. Soviet river ships fought in the very heart of the Third Reich. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered. The Dnieper Flotilla was in the city, on the Spree River. The sailors witnessed and participated in the greatest triumph, the fall of the capital of Nazi Germany. The journey from the Dnieper to Berlin was complete. The task was accomplished. Victory was achieved. The river flotillas proved that they were a formidable fighting force capable of solving strategic tasks. Comparing the actions of the two flotillas, the Danube and Dnieper, we can see how river warfare was conducted in two directions: south through the Balkans to Austria, and north through Poland to Germany. Both flotillas made an invaluable contribution to the overall victory. They ensured the advance of ground forces along waterways, landed dozens of troops, suppressed hundreds of coastal targets, and destroyed enemy river forces. Without river flotillas, the war in these theaters would have been different and probably longer. The history of river warfare was not limited to the Danube and Dnieper. Soviet river flotillas operated on dozens of waterways across Europe, creating a unique system of mobile forces capable of advancing deep into the continent in the wake of the advancing troops. The Dnieper flotilla's journey from the Dnieper to Berlin became one of the most impressive marches in the history of the naval forces. After the liberation of Belarus in the summer of 1944, the ships of the Dnieper flotilla operated on the Pripyat and its tributaries. These small rivers flowed through marshy terrain, and navigation was extremely difficult. But it was here that river ships proved indispensable. They delivered cargo and reinforcements to places where vehicles could not go, and supported troops with firepower where it was impossible to deploy field artillery. In the fall of 1944, the flotilla moved to the Western Bug. This transition was carried out partly under its own power through the Dnieper Bug Canal and partly by rail. Ships that were too large for the canal were transported on railway platforms. It was an extremely complex logistical operation that required coordination between the fleet, railway troops, and engineering units. But the Soviet command coped with the task. On the Western Bug, the flotilla again entered the battle. The river was an important defensive line for German troops retreating from Belarus and Ukraine. The flotilla's ships supported the Soviet forces' crossing of the Bug, landed troops, and suppressed German strongholds on the banks. Particularly fierce battles took place in the Brest area, where the Germans attempted to gain a foothold in the old fortifications of the Brest fortress. In the winter of 1944-1945, the flotilla moved to the Vistula, Poland's largest river. The Vistula flowed from south to north across the entire country and emptied into the Baltic Sea. Control of this river was of enormous strategic importance. Ships of the Dnieper flotilla patrolled the Vistula, ensuring the safety of crossings and communications for the Red Army advancing in Poland. January 1945 brought the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive offensive that resulted in Soviet troops advancing more than 500 kilometers from the Vistula to the Oder in 3 weeks. The Dnieper flotilla secured crossings over the Vistula and then rapidly advanced westward in pursuit of the troops. The ships were transported by rail, under their own power along rivers and canals, and by any other means available. In February, the flotilla's advance ships reached the Oder. This mighty river flowed from south to north through Silesia and Brandenburg, forming the last major water barrier before Berlin. The Germans turned the Oder into a powerful line of defense, blowing up bridges and creating coastal fortifications. But the Dnieper flotilla broke through to the river and secured its position there, preparing for the final push on Berlin. In March 1945, part of the flotilla's ships moved from the Oder to the Spree through a system of canals. The Spree, a small river flowing through Berlin, was the last waterway to the capital of the Third Reich. Navigation through the narrow canals connecting the Oder and the Spree required the highest level of skill. But the Soviet sailors coped, guiding monitors and armored boats through the most difficult route. The Dnieper flotilla's journey from the Dnieper to Berlin was about 2,000 kilometers. The ships passed through the Pripyat, Western Bug, Vistula, Oder, and Spree rivers. It was an unprecedented march of river forces, unparalleled in world naval history. The flotilla crossed half of Europe, participating in the liberation of Belarus and Poland, and the defeat of Germany. Now the last frontier remained, Berlin itself, and the river sailors were preparing to enter the lair of the beast. At 3 o'clock in the morning on April 16, 1945, the sky over the Oder was lit up by the light of 140 searchlights. The Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation began, the final battle of the Great Patriotic War. More than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by 6,000 tanks, 42,000 guns and mortars, and 7,000 aircraft, descended on the last defensive lines of the Third Reich. And among this military machine of unprecedented scale were the ships of the Dnieper military flotilla. The flotilla's task was clearly defined: to ensure the crossing of the Oder by the troops of the First Belarusian Front, to land troops to capture bridgeheads, to support the advancing units with fire, and then to enter Berlin via the Spree and participate in the assault on the city. Never before had a river flotilla been given such an ambitious task: to participate in the assault on the enemy capital, a city with a population of over 4 million. On the morning of April 16th, the flotilla's armored boats and gunboats took up firing positions on the Oder. Their guns opened fire on German fortifications on the opposite bank, supporting the artillery preparation of the ground forces. The 76mm and 102mm guns of the river ships fired methodically, suppressing coastal batteries and destroying pillboxes and dugouts. The ship's guns worked in concert with thousands of other artillery barrels. When the infantry began crossing the Oder, the flotilla's ships provided cover. Armored boats covered the landing craft, repelling counterattacks by German artillery and aircraft. Despite fierce enemy resistance, the crossing was successful. The bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oder were expanded, and the troops rushed towards Berlin. The flotilla moved with them. On April 21st, the leading armored boats of the Dnieper flotilla entered the Spree and reached the outskirts of Berlin. It was a historic moment. Soviet river ships had entered the capital of the enemy that had attacked the Soviet Union 4 years earlier. Now the war had returned to the one who had started it. The ships took up positions on the river flowing through the city center and opened fire on German positions. The fighting in Berlin was for every block, every street, every house. German troops and Volkssturm units fought with the desperation of the doomed, turning the city into a fortress. Under these conditions, the ships of the Dnieper flotilla became mobile firing points, capable of moving along the Spree and providing support to assault groups. The ship's artillery pounded the buildings where German machine gunners and snipers were holed up. Armored boats proved to be particularly effective. Their small size allowed them to maneuver on the narrow river, evading enemy fire. 76mm guns in tank turrets fired accurately at specific buildings and firing points. The crews of the armored boats worked closely with ground units. Infantrymen designated targets, and the ships destroyed them with fire. Due to their size, the monitors could not enter the narrow Spree in the city center, but they operated on the outskirts, firing at German reserves, warehouses, and communication centers. Their 102mm guns fired at long range, hitting targets deep in enemy defenses. Every shell fired by the monitors counted in urban combat, where high accuracy was essential. On April 29th, the assault on the Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi Germany, began. Ships of the Dnieper flotilla fired from their positions on the Spree toward the government quarter. Although the Reichstag itself was some distance from the river, the ship's artillery suppressed the German positions that were hindering the advance of the assault groups. On April 30th, the red banner of victory was raised over the Reichstag. On May 2, 1945, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The ships of the Dnieper flotilla stood on the Spree in the center of the defeated capital of the Third Reich. The sailors witnessed the greatest triumph in history, the complete defeat of Nazi Germany. The journey from the Dnieper to Berlin was complete. Revenge for June 22, 1941, had been taken, and victory was complete. Hundreds of sailors from the Dnieper flotilla were awarded orders and medals for their participation in the Berlin operation. Many ships received honorary names. The flotilla proved that river forces can be a decisive factor, even in such complex operations as the storming of a major city. The history of river warfare ended in Berlin with the triumph of Soviet weapons. When the guns fell silent and the war ended, it was time to take stock. Soviet river military flotillas played a role in the Great Patriotic War that cannot be overestimated. From the first days of the war on the Danube to the last volleys in Berlin, river ships were wherever there were waterways, turning rivers from transport arteries into front lines and springboards for offensives. During the 4 years of the war, river flotillas carried out hundreds of combat operations. The Danube flotilla alone, in its second formation, landed more than 20 large assaults, transported tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo across the Danube, and fired more than 100,000 artillery shells at the enemy. The Dnieper flotilla made an unprecedented crossing from the Dnieper to Berlin, participating in the liberation of 3 countries. The Volga flotilla saved Stalingrad by providing crossings across the Volga during the critical months of the battle. The casualty statistics were heavy. Dozens of ships were lost in battle, hit by mines or sunk by enemy aircraft. Thousands of sailors gave their lives for victory. The Pinsk flotilla was almost completely destroyed in the battles of 1941. The first Danube flotilla was disbanded after the heaviest fighting, but new ships and new crews replaced those who had been lost, continuing the work of their fallen comrades. The heroism of the river sailors was recognized by the state. Thousands of sailors received orders and medals, and dozens were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Many ships were given the honorary names of liberated cities. The flotillas were awarded orders. The Danube flotilla received the Order of the Red Banner, and the Dnieper flotilla received the Order of Ushakov, First Class. These awards were well-deserved. The river sailors fought no less bravely than their comrades in the ocean fleets. The role of river flotillas in landing operations was of particular importance. During the war, more than 40 major river landings were carried out, from the Danube landing on June 24, 1941, to the landings in Berlin in April-May 1945. River landings made it possible to bypass enemy defensive lines, capture bridgeheads in their rear, and disrupt the organized retreat of enemy troops. Many of these operations were of strategic importance. Artillery support for ground forces was the second most important task of the flotillas. Monitors and gunboats with their powerful guns became mobile artillery batteries capable of moving quickly along the front and concentrating fire on decisive areas. In conditions where it was difficult to move heavy artillery across destroyed bridges and ruined roads, river ships proved indispensable. Securing crossings and protecting communications was the third key function of the flotillas. The Volga flotilla ensured the continuous supply of Stalingrad's defenders across the Volga under enemy fire. The Dnieper flotilla organized crossings across many rivers from the Dnieper to the Oder. The Danube flotilla controlled the most important waterway in Central Europe for 2,000 kilometers. Without this work, the Red Army's offensive would have been significantly hampered. After the war, the river flotillas were reorganized. Many ships were decommissioned or transferred to other countries as reparations and aid. The Danube flotilla continued to serve, patrolling the Soviet section of the Danube. The Dnieper flotilla was disbanded, its ships distributed among other units. But the memory of the exploits of the river sailors has been preserved. Their experience was studied in naval schools, books were written about them, and films were made. The River War of 1941-1945 proved that rivers can be a full-fledged theater of war. Properly organized river flotillas are capable of solving strategic tasks, influencing the course of campaigns, and determining the outcome of battles. The experience of the Soviet river flotillas remains unique in world naval history. From the Danube to Berlin, from the Volga to the Spree, river sailors fought their way to victory, and their feat is forever inscribed in the annals of the Great Patriotic War.